What if I told you that the very thing you think will set you free might actually be the chain that binds you? Today, I want to share with you a story that will challenge everything you believe about spiritual seeking and the meaning of life. Picture this: a small village nestled between rolling mountains and crystal clear rivers, the kind of place where time moves slowly and every face is familiar. In this peaceful setting lived a man named Samuel. Now Samuel wasn't rich, but he wasn't poor either. He had a loving wife, healthy children, and steady work. From the outside, his life looked complete. But here's the thing about Samuel. Every morning, he would wake up before dawn with a heavy feeling in his chest. He would go through his daily routine, working hard, providing for his family, being the responsible husband and father everyone expected him to be. Yet something was missing. Something deep inside him felt hollow, like there was a void that no amount of work or responsibility could fill. Have you ever felt this way? Like you're going through the motions of life but somehow missing the real meaning? Like there's something more you're supposed to be doing, some greater purpose you're meant to fulfill. Samuel felt this every single day. At night, he would lie awake watching his wife sleep peacefully beside him, listening to his children's gentle breathing in the next room. And instead of feeling contentment, his mind would race with questions. Am I doing enough? Is this really what life is about? What is my true purpose? This restlessness, this deep dissatisfaction with ordinary life is what we call dukkha in Buddhism. It's not just sadness or pain. It's that fundamental unease that tells us something isn't quite right, even when everything appears to be perfect. Samuel's story is about to take a dramatic turn. He's going to make a choice that will teach him the hardest lesson of his life. A lesson about attachment, about ego, and about what true spiritual wisdom really means. Are you ready to discover what Samuel learned? Because I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll never look at your own spiritual journey the same way again. So there was Samuel, trapped in what many of us would consider a blessed life. Every morning before the sun painted the sky, he would quietly slip out of bed, careful not to wake his sleeping family. The floorboards knew his routine by now, creaking softly under his familiar footsteps as he prepared for another day of work. Samuel wasn't lazy. Oh no, quite the opposite. He was the kind of man who took his responsibilities seriously. He worked from sunrise to sunset, his hands rough from honest labor, his back aching from the weight of providing for those he loved. When he returned home each evening, his wife would greet him with a warm smile. His children would run to embrace him, and for a moment, everything would feel right. But then the moment would pass. You see, Samuel carried a burden that had nothing to do with money or material needs. His family had enough to eat, a roof over their heads, clothes on their backs. They were safe, they were healthy, they were together. By all accounts, Samuel should have been content, but contentment felt like a foreign concept to him. At dinner, while his family laughed and shared stories from their day, Samuel would find himself staring off into the distance, his mind wandering to places he couldn't quite name. His wife would notice sometimes, reaching across the table to touch his hand gently, asking if everything was all right. And Samuel would smile and nod, because what else could he say? How could he explain that he felt like he was drowning in normalcy? This is what we call dukkha, my friends. It's one of the fundamental truths that Buddha taught us. Dukkha isn't just about obvious suffering like illness or poverty. It's about that subtle but persistent sense that something is off, even when life appears perfect. It's the feeling that you're living someone else's life, going through motions that feel hollow and meaningless. Samuel's dukkha was particularly painful because it was mixed with guilt. Here he was, blessed with a loving family, steady work, and a peaceful home, yet he felt ungrateful for wanting more. He would lie awake at night, listening to his wife's gentle breathing, watching the moonlight filter through their bedroom window and feel like a fraud. The questions would come in waves during these sleepless hours. Am I enough for them? Am I guiding my family in the right direction? Is this monotonous routine really what life is supposed to be about? The questions felt like tiny needles pricking at his consciousness, keeping him awake when his body desperately needed rest. During the day, Samuel would look around at his neighbors, his co-workers, the other fathers in the village, and wonder if they felt this same restlessness. Did they wake up each morning with a sense of purpose, or were they all just pretending, like actors in a play they never auditioned for? Samuel began to feel like he was sleepwalking through his own existence. He would perform his duties, speak his lines, play his role as husband and father, but inside, a voice kept whispering that there had to be more. There had to be a deeper meaning, a greater purpose, something that would make all this daily routine feel worthwhile. This inner turmoil was like a seed planted in dark soil. Day by day, it grew stronger, fed by Samuel's increasing dissatisfaction with the ordinary rhythm of village life. He began to feel that his work, his relationships, even his love for his family were somehow keeping him from discovering his true calling. And that's when the dangerous thought began to take root. Maybe, just maybe, he was meant for something different, something higher, something that would finally give his life the meaning it seemed to lack. Little did Samuel know that this very thought, this seemingly innocent desire for deeper purpose, would soon lead him down a path that would change everything he thought he knew about love, sacrifice, and what it truly means to live a meaningful life. The turning point came on a particularly restless morning when Samuel found himself remembering conversations he'd overheard in the village marketplace. The elderly folks, weathered by decades of life experience, sometimes spoke in hushed tones about a wise man who lived high in the mountains. They said this hermit possessed answers to life's deepest questions, that he could guide lost souls toward enlightenment. At first, Samuel had dismissed these stories as village folklore, but as his inner turmoil grew stronger, those whispered tales began to feel like lifelines thrown to a drowning man. What if there really was someone who could explain this gnawing emptiness inside him? What if the answers he sought weren't found in his daily routine, but somewhere beyond the familiar boundaries of his small world? The idea consumed him. During his work, while his hands moved through familiar tasks, his mind wandered to the mountains. What would this wise man look like? What profound truths might he share? Samuel imagined himself returning to his family with newfound wisdom, finally able to embrace his role as husband and father with genuine contentment instead of resigned duty. One morning, without telling his family where he was going, Samuel set out toward the mountain peaks. The path was steeper than he'd expected, winding through dense forests and rocky terrain. With each step, The familiar sounds of village life faded behind him, replaced by the whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant call of mountain birds. Hours passed. Samuel's legs ached. His breathing grew labored, but something inside him felt lighter than it had in years. This was action. This was movement toward something meaningful. For the first time in so long, he felt like he was walking toward his destiny rather than trudging through another meaningless day. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Samuel spotted a small wooden cabin perched on a rocky outcrop. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, and the air around it seemed different somehow, cleaner and more peaceful. As he approached, an elderly man emerged from the cabin, moving with the calm grace of someone completely at peace with the world. The hermit's eyes were deep and knowing, as if he'd been expecting Samuel's arrival. There was something almost timeless about him, as if he existed outside the ordinary flow of days and seasons that governed village life. "Welcome, traveler," the old man said, his voice soft but carrying easily in the mountain air. "You have come far. What is it that you seek?" Samuel felt his prepared words dissolve on his tongue. Standing before this serene figure, his carefully rehearsed explanation seemed inadequate. Instead, he found himself speaking from the heart, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to explain it," Samuel began, feeling the weight of months of inner struggle pressing against his chest. "I have a family, work, a home. Everyone tells me I should be grateful, and I am. But there's something missing. I feel like I'm living someone else's life, going through motions that don't touch whatever is real inside me. I keep thinking there must be more to existence than this endless routine." The hermit nodded slowly, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd heard this story before, Samuel realized. How many others had climbed this mountain carrying the same burden of dissatisfaction? "The one who seeks answers has already taken the first step," the wise man replied. "But tell me, young father, what would you be willing to sacrifice to find what you're looking for?" The question hit Samuel like a physical blow. He hadn't expected to be asked about sacrifice. He'd imagined the hermit would offer wisdom freely, perhaps meditation techniques or philosophical insights that would help him find peace within his current life. But sacrifice, what could that possibly mean? "I'm not sure I understand," Samuel said, though something deep in his stomach suggested he understood all too well. The hermit's eyes grew more intense, more penetrating. "Attachment is the root of all suffering," he explained. "Your restlessness doesn't come from lacking something, but from fearing the loss of what you already have. You seek meaning in life, but you carry chains that prevent you from moving forward." Samuel felt his heart begin to race. The hermit's words were touching something he'd been trying not to acknowledge. Was he suggesting that Samuel's love for his family was somehow holding him back from spiritual growth? "My family is everything to me," Samuel protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "I work for them, I live for them. They're not chains, they're the reason I want to find meaning in the first place." The hermit's smile was patient but knowing. "And if I told you that you'll only find true peace when you stop clinging to them, when you release your need to be needed?" The mountain air suddenly felt thin and cold. Samuel's mind reeled as he tried to process what he was hearing. Was this wise man actually suggesting that he abandon his family? That seemed not just wrong but impossible. But then the hermit spoke again, and his words would change everything. If you truly seek enlightenment, if your purpose is pure, then trust that those you love will find their way without you. The path to spiritual awakening sometimes requires the ultimate letting go. Only by releasing everything can you discover what is eternal within yourself. Samuel felt something shift inside him, like a door opening to a room he'd never known existed. The hermit's words were radical, even shocking, but they carried a strange logic that spoke to his deepest dissatisfaction. What if his attachment to his family, his need to be their provider and protector, was actually preventing him from discovering his true spiritual nature? As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Samuel found himself considering the unthinkable. What if the only way to find real meaning was to let go of everything he thought he couldn't live without? The hermit watched him silently, allowing the weight of possibility to settle in Samuel's mind. And in that silence, a dangerous seed was planted, a seed that would grow into the most devastating decision of Samuel's life. The days following Samuel's encounter with the hermit were a torment of indecision. He returned home carrying the old man's words like burning coals in his chest. Every interaction with his family felt different now, charged with a terrible new awareness. When his wife smiled at him over breakfast, Samuel found himself wondering if her happiness depended too heavily on his presence. When his children ran to greet him at the end of each workday, he questioned whether their joy was genuine or simply the result of unhealthy attachment. The hermit's teachings had planted a seed of doubt that grew stronger with each passing hour. At night, lying beside his sleeping wife, Samuel would stare at the ceiling and wrestle with thoughts that felt both enlightening and terrifying. What if his role as husband and father was actually preventing him from discovering his true spiritual nature? What if his family's dependence on him was keeping all of them trapped in a cycle of ordinary existence? The more he contemplated the hermit's words, the more convinced he became that radical action was necessary. Half measures wouldn't work. He couldn't simply meditate more or read spiritual texts while maintaining his current life. No, if he truly wanted to break free from the chains of attachment, he needed to sever them completely. But how could he simply walk away from his family? How could he explain to his wife and children that he was abandoning them for the sake of spiritual growth? They would never understand. They would try to convince him to stay, and their love might weaken his resolve. Worse, they might follow him, defeating the entire purpose of his spiritual quest. Then a terrible idea began to form in Samuel's mind. What if he didn't have to explain anything? What if he could free himself and his family from the burden of attachment in one decisive act? What if he died? Not literally, of course. But what if his family believed he had died? They would grieve, certainly, but then they would be forced to move on, to discover their own inner strength, to find their own spiritual path without depending on him. And he would be free to pursue enlightenment without the weight of their expectations and needs. The plan was both elegant and horrifying. Samuel spent days refining the details, his mind working with a clarity that felt almost supernatural. He would stage his own death by drowning in the river. The current was strong enough to carry a body far downstream, so the absence of remains wouldn't seem suspicious. His family would assume he had been swept away, and after a period of mourning, they would learn to live without him. Samuel convinced himself that this was the ultimate act of love. By removing himself from their lives, he would force his family to grow stronger, more independent, more spiritually mature. He was giving them the gift of freedom, even if they wouldn't understand it at first. The morning he chose for his false death dawned bright and clear. Samuel felt strangely calm as he prepared for what he believed would be his final day as a father and husband. He was extra gentle with his children at breakfast, memorizing their faces, their voices, their innocent laughter. He kissed his wife goodbye with unusual tenderness, holding her perhaps a moment longer than normal. That afternoon, Samuel suggested a family outing to the river. It was a beautiful day, he said, perfect for a picnic by the water. His family was delighted by this unexpected treat. They packed food and blankets, and together they walked to their favorite spot along the riverbank. For a few hours, Samuel allowed himself to simply be present with his family. He watched his children play in the shallow water, their joy infectious and pure. He sat with his wife in comfortable silence, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face and the softness of the grass beneath them. For a moment, he almost wavered in his resolve. But then he remembered the hermit's words about attachment being the root of suffering. This peaceful scene, beautiful as it was, represented everything he needed to transcend. His family's happiness in this moment was built on the illusion of permanence, on the assumption that he would always be there to provide and protect. By breaking that illusion, he would be teaching them the most important lesson of all, that true security comes from within, not from external relationships. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel began to distance himself from the group, walking closer to the water's edge. He called out to his family, telling them he wanted to cool off in the deeper part of the river. His wife waved from the blanket where she sat with their youngest child. His older children were busy building something with river stones and barely looked up. Samuel waded into the water, feeling the current tug at his legs. The river was cold and swift, fed by mountain snow even in the warmer months. When he reached the deepest part, he took several deep breaths, filling his lungs with air. Then he disappeared beneath the surface. Samuel had practiced holding his breath for weeks in preparation for this moment. He stayed underwater as long as he could, feeling his lungs burn with the effort. When he finally surfaced, he was far downstream from his family, hidden by a bend in the river and thick reeds along the bank. From his hiding place, he could hear his family's voices changing from casual conversation to concern to panic. His wife was calling his name, her voice rising with each unanswered call. His children were crying, their innocent game forgotten in the face of sudden terror. Samuel felt his heart clench with pain, but he forced himself to remain hidden. This was necessary, he told himself. This moment of suffering would ultimately lead to their liberation. He listened as neighbors arrived, drawn by the commotion. He heard the splash of people entering the water to search for him. He heard his wife's sobs and his children's frightened questions. As darkness fell and the search was reluctantly abandoned, Samuel crept through the reeds along the riverbank, moving further from his former life with each step. Behind him, he could hear his family's grief echoing across the water, but he hardened his heart against their pain. This was the price of spiritual freedom, both for him and for them. By dawn, Samuel had traveled far from the village, his clothes still damp from the river, his body shivering with cold and exhaustion. But his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. He had done it. He had broken free from the chains of attachment. He had chosen the spiritual path over the comfortable prison of family life. What Samuel didn't yet understand was that he hadn't broken free from anything. He had simply traded one form of attachment for another. His need to be needed, his ego's desire to be the center of his family's world, had led him to commit the ultimate act of selfishness disguised as spiritual sacrifice. But that realization was still to come. For now, Samuel walked into the mountains, convinced that he had taken the first step toward enlightenment, unaware that he had actually taken the first step toward the most painful lesson of his life. In the weeks that followed his staged death, Samuel lived the life of a wandering monk. He slept under the stars, ate wild berries and roots, and spent long hours in what he believed was deep meditation. The physical hardships felt purifying, each discomfort a step closer to enlightenment. He told himself that the ache in his stomach from hunger was teaching him to transcend bodily needs. The cold mountain nights were lessons in endurance and spiritual strength. But there was one thing Samuel couldn't transcend, no matter how hard he meditated or how many spiritual practices he attempted. The question that haunted his every waking moment was simple yet tormenting. What had become of his family? During the day, Samuel could distract himself with the business of survival, finding food, shelter, navigating the mountain paths. But at night, when the world grew quiet and his mind had nowhere to hide, the questions would come flooding back. How were his children coping with their grief? Was his wife managing to care for them alone? Had the village rallied around them, or were they struggling in ways he couldn't bear to imagine? Samuel tried to convince himself that these thoughts were just the last remnants of attachment working their way out of his system. The hermit had warned him that letting go would be difficult, that his mind would try to pull him back into old patterns of thinking. This worry about his family was just ego, just the illusion of separateness that spiritual practice was meant to dissolve. But the questions grew stronger, not weaker, with each passing day. Samuel began to rationalize that perhaps a brief visit, just to observe from a distance, would actually help his spiritual progress. If he could see that his family was thriving without him, it would prove that his sacrifice had been worthwhile. It would validate his choice and allow him to move forward on his spiritual journey with a clear conscience. One evening, as the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel made his decision. He would return to the village, not to reveal himself, but simply to see how his family was managing. Just one look, he told himself, just enough to confirm that they were learning to live independently, growing stronger through the challenge of his absence. The journey back felt both eternal and frighteningly quick. With each familiar landmark, Samuel's heart beat faster. Part of him hoped to find his family struggling, proving how much they had needed him. But the larger part, the part he thought was becoming more spiritually mature, hoped to find them flourishing, demonstrating that his sacrifice had set them free to discover their own inner strength. When Samuel finally reached the outskirts of his village, night had fallen. The familiar sounds and smells of home hit him like a physical force. There was the baker's chimney sending up its evening smoke, the distant sound of children playing, the warm glow of lamplight spilling from cottage windows. Everything looked exactly as he had left it, as if time had stood still in his absence. Samuel made his way carefully through the shadows, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. When he finally reached his former home, he crept close to the window and peered inside, preparing himself for whatever scene awaited him. What he saw stopped his breath entirely. His family was gathered around the dinner table, and they were laughing. Not the forced, hollow laughter of people trying to mask their pain, but genuine, bubbling joy. His wife's face was radiant as she served the evening meal. His children were animated, sharing stories from their day with enthusiasm and delight. The house felt warm, alive, filled with the same love and contentment that had once made Samuel feel so trapped. But there was something different, something that made Samuel's stomach clench with a feeling he couldn't name. His family didn't look like people who were grieving. They didn't look like people who were struggling to rebuild their lives after a devastating loss. They looked like people who had simply moved on. Samuel pressed closer to the window, searching desperately for signs of the suffering he had expected to find. Surely there would be some indication of the void his absence had left. An empty chair at the table perhaps, or moments of sadness when they remembered him. Instead, he watched his wife laugh at something one of their children said. He saw his oldest son helping serve the meal, taking on responsibilities with natural ease. His daughter was telling an animated story about something that had happened at school, her face bright with excitement. Where was the grief? Where was the struggle? Where was any sign that his death had created the kind of devastating loss that would force them to grow spiritually? Samuel stayed at that window for hours, watching his family's evening routine unfold. They cleaned up from dinner together, the children helping willingly. His wife read them a bedtime story, her voice calm and soothing. Everyone seemed peaceful, content complete. As the house grew quiet and the lamps were extinguished, Samuel stumbled away from the window, his mind reeling. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't what the hermit had promised would happen. According to the spiritual teachings he had embraced, his family should have been forced to confront their attachment, to discover their own inner strength through the challenge of his absence. But they hadn't been challenged at all. They had simply continued. Over the following days, Samuel found himself returning again and again to spy on his former life. Each observation brought fresh shock. His family's routine had adjusted to accommodate his absence, but they hadn't collapsed. If anything, they seemed more relaxed, more naturally harmonious than he remembered. The neighbors were helping more than before, bringing meals and offering assistance with daily tasks. His wife had taken on some of his former responsibilities, but seemed to handle them with quiet competence. His children were thriving in school, making new friends, pursuing interests that Samuel realized he had never really encouraged when he was consumed with his own spiritual dissatisfaction. The truth hit Samuel like an avalanche, crushing and inescapable. His family hadn't needed him in the way he had convinced himself they did. His role as the indispensable provider and protector had been largely a creation of his own ego. They were capable of happiness, growth, and spiritual development without him. More devastating still was the realization that his absence might actually have improved their lives in some ways. Without his restless energy, his constant questioning, his underlying dissatisfaction with their simple family life, the house felt more peaceful. His wife seemed lighter, less burdened by the need to constantly reassure him that their life together was meaningful. Samuel had believed that by sacrificing himself for spiritual enlightenment, he was performing the ultimate act of love. But the cold truth staring him in the face was undeniable. His family hadn't been liberated by his sacrifice. They had been liberated from his need to be their savior. All those months of feeling trapped by responsibility, of believing that his family's dependence on him was preventing his spiritual growth, had been based on a fundamental delusion. The prison he had felt trapped in wasn't created by his family's needs. It was created by his own ego's need to be needed. As Samuel crouched in the shadows outside his former home, watching his family live their lives with apparent contentment and peace, he finally understood the true meaning of the hermit's teaching about attachment. The attachment that was causing his suffering wasn't his love for his family. It was his attachment to being the center of their world. And that realization shattered everything he thought he knew about himself, about love, and about what it truly means to seek spiritual enlightenment. The weeks that followed Samuel's devastating realization were perhaps the darkest of his entire life. He wandered the forest surrounding his village like a ghost, unable to return to his spiritual quest, but equally unable to accept what he had discovered about himself and his family. The truth was too painful to bear. Everything he had believed about his importance in his family's life had been an illusion. The sacrifice he thought would demonstrate his spiritual dedication had actually revealed the depth of his selfishness. His family's ability to thrive without him proved that his presence had been far less essential than his ego had convinced him. But Samuel's pride wouldn't let him simply accept this truth and walk away. Instead, a darker impulse began to grow within him. If his family could move on so easily, then perhaps they needed to be reminded of what they had lost. Perhaps their apparent contentment was just a facade, and underneath they were actually struggling more than he could see from his hiding place in the shadows. Samuel began to concoct a plan that revealed just how far his spiritual journey had led him astray. He would test his family's supposed peace by planting seeds of doubt about his death. If they truly loved him, if his absence had truly affected them, then the mere suggestion that he might still be alive would shatter their calm facade and reveal their hidden grief. He started small, speaking to traveling merchants who passed through the village. He would approach them on the roads outside town, claiming to be a wanderer who had heard rumors about a man who had faked his own drowning. He spun elaborate tales about seeing someone matching his own description in distant villages, always careful to make the stories just believable enough to be repeated. Samuel watched from the shadows as these rumors began to circulate through the village. He waited eagerly for signs that the stories were reaching his family, for some indication that the possibility of his survival would bring their carefully constructed new life crashing down. But when he finally observed his family's reaction to these rumors, Samuel received another crushing blow to his already wounded pride. He was hidden near the village well one afternoon when he heard his wife speaking with a neighbor woman who had clearly come to share the latest gossip about the mysterious stranger spreading stories about Samuel's supposed survival. Samuel held his breath, expecting to see his wife break down with renewed grief or explode with desperate hope. Instead, he watched her listen to the rumors with a calm expression that never wavered. When the neighbor finished her breathless recounting of the tales, Samuel's wife was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke words that cut through Samuel's heart like a blade. "It doesn't matter whether those stories are true or not," she said simply. "The man we knew and loved died that day at the river. Even if someone wearing his face were to walk back into our lives, Samuel as we knew him is gone forever. We've learned to find our peace without him, and that's something no one can take away from us." Samuel felt his knees buckle as the full weight of those words hit him. His wife wasn't in denial about the possibility of his survival. She had simply moved beyond the need for him to define her happiness or her family's well-being. The rumors he had so carefully planted had been acknowledged and then dismissed, not out of lack of love, but out of a strength he had never given her credit for possessing. But Samuel's ego wouldn't let him accept even this devastating truth. If subtle rumors couldn't shake his family's newfound peace, then perhaps a more direct approach was needed. Perhaps seeing him in person, alive and real, would finally prove that they couldn't simply move on without him. The decision to reveal himself was born not from love or spiritual insight, but from wounded pride and a desperate need to matter in the lives of the people he had abandoned. Samuel convinced himself that his family's apparent contentment was just a protective shell they had built around their true feelings. Surely, when they saw him alive, their carefully maintained composure would crumble, revealing the depth of their hidden pain and their desperate need for his return. On a quiet afternoon when the children were playing in the garden and his wife was hanging laundry in the yard, Samuel finally stepped out of the shadows. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, imagining tearful reunions, desperate embraces, and heartfelt pleas for forgiveness. His children saw him first. For a moment, their faces showed pure shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. But they didn't run to him with cries of joy. Instead, they seemed to freeze, uncertain how to react to this ghost from their past suddenly materializing in their present. His wife turned when she noticed the children's strange stillness, and her eyes met Samuel's across the garden. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Then, instead of the emotional breakdown Samuel had expected, his wife's expression settled into something that looked almost like resignation. "I'm here," Samuel said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I've come back. I'm alive." But instead of running to embrace him, instead of weeping with relief or even anger, his wife simply stood where she was, her hand still holding the piece of clothing she had been hanging. "Samuel died at the river that day," she said quietly, her voice steady and sure. "I don't know who you are, but the man I married chose to leave us. The man I loved would never have put his children through the pain of believing their father was dead." The words hit Samuel like physical blows. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined. This wasn't the desperate need for his return that his ego had convinced him he would find. "I did it for us," Samuel protested, his voice rising with desperation. "I was seeking enlightenment, trying to find a deeper purpose so I could be a better husband and father." His wife's smile was sad but firm. "No," she replied. "You did it for yourself. You convinced yourself that our love was a burden, that our need for you was holding you back from something greater. But the truth is, you couldn't bear the thought of being ordinary. You couldn't find meaning in the simple act of loving and being loved." Samuel opened his mouth to argue, to explain, to somehow make her understand the spiritual significance of his actions. But looking into her eyes, he realized that she did understand. She understood better than he did. She understood that his spiritual quest had been nothing more than elaborate selfishness. She understood that his sacrifice had been motivated not by love for his family, but by love for an idealized version of himself. She understood that the man she had married, the father her children had known, really had died that day at the river, killed not by water but by pride. "If you were truly seeking enlightenment," his wife said gently, "I hope you found it. But you won't find it here. You can't come back, Samuel. We've learned to live without you, and that's a gift we won't give up, not even for you." Samuel stood in that garden, surrounded by the life he had abandoned, and finally understood the true cost of his spiritual pride. He had gained nothing and lost everything. His quest for enlightenment had led him not to wisdom, but to the complete destruction of everything he had once held dear. As he turned to walk away from his family for the final time, Samuel realized that the hermit's teaching about attachment had been true, but not in the way he had understood it. The attachment that had caused his suffering wasn't his love for his family. It was his attachment to being more than he was, to being special, to being indispensable. And now, having severed that attachment in the most brutal way possible, Samuel was finally free. Free to discover what it meant to truly have nothing, to truly be alone, to truly understand the difference between spiritual seeking and spiritual pride. The lesson was complete, but the price had been everything he had ever loved. And so Samuel walked away from his family for the last time, carrying with him the heaviest burden of all, the truth about himself. As he disappeared into the gathering dusk, he finally understood what real spiritual awakening looks like. It doesn't come from dramatic gestures or radical sacrifices. It comes from the quiet recognition of our own self-deception. You see, my friends, Samuel's story isn't really about a man who abandoned his family. It's about something much more universal, something that touches every one of us who has ever felt the calling towards spiritual growth. It's about the difference between genuine spiritual seeking and what we might call spiritual materialism. Samuel thought he was pursuing enlightenment, but what he was really pursuing was a more flattering image of himself. He couldn't bear to be ordinary, couldn't find meaning in the simple act of showing up for the people who loved him. His spiritual quest was really just another form of ego, dressed up in the language of transcendence. The hermit's teaching about attachment was true, but Samuel misunderstood it completely. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering, but he wasn't talking about love itself. He was talking about our need to possess, to control, to be the center of other people's worlds. Samuel's attachment wasn't to his family. It was to being needed by them, to being indispensable to their happiness. When we truly love someone, we want what's best for them, even if that doesn't include us. But when we're attached to someone, we need them to need us. We need to be the source of their joy, the solution to their problems, the meaning in their lives. And when they show us that they can be happy without us, our ego feels threatened. True spiritual practice asks us to love without possessing, to serve without needing recognition, to find meaning in ordinary moments rather than seeking extraordinary experiences. It asks us to embrace our responsibilities not as burdens that hold us back from enlightenment, but as opportunities to practice compassion, patience, and selfless love. Samuel's family found peace not because they stopped loving him, but because they learned that love doesn't require dependency. They discovered their own strength, their own capacity for joy, their own connection to something greater than any individual relationship. Ironically, they found the spiritual growth that Samuel had been seeking, and they found it precisely by accepting their ordinary life and making the best of it. The most profound spiritual truth is often the simplest one. We don't need to abandon our lives to find meaning. We need to find meaning in the lives we're already living. The dishes that need washing, the children who need attention, the partners who need understanding. These aren't obstacles to enlightenment. They are enlightenment if we approach them with the right spirit. Every moment offers us a choice. We can see our circumstances as prisons that limit our spiritual potential, or we can see them as classrooms that teach us everything we need to know about love, patience, and what it truly means to be human. Samuel learned this lesson in the hardest way possible. He lost everything he loved to discover that what he was seeking was already present in what he had. But you don't have to make Samuel's mistake. You can find the sacred in the ordinary, the profound in the simple, the extraordinary in the everyday act of loving the people right in front of you. The next time you feel that restless urge for something more, something deeper, something that will finally give your life meaning, remember Samuel's story. Look around at your ordinary life, at the ordinary people who love you, at the ordinary moments that make up your days. The enlightenment you're seeking isn't hiding in some distant mountain cave. It's right here, right now, in this very moment, waiting for you to recognize it. Because in the end, life continues with or without us. The question isn't whether we matter, but how we choose to matter. And the most beautiful way to matter is simply to love well, serve faithfully, and find joy in the simple miracle of being present for each other. That's the lesson Samuel learned too late, but it's never too late for us to learn it now.